Every generation, I suppose, sees the time in which they live as being exceptional. The truth of the matter is, you do live in a most exceptional time in the history of mankind. You young people will see events transpire which were promised from the beginning of the world. Prophets of old have seen your days and rejoiced in them. And yet you will face challenges and circumstances, the severity of which has been unparalleled in generations past.
We're at war with the most dangerous enemy that has ever faced mankind in his long climb from the swamp to the stars. And it's been said if we lose that war, and in so doing lose this way of freedom of ours, history will record with the greatest astonishment that those who had the most to lose did the least to prevent its happening.
There's a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all.
Welcome to Arena Radio, the battlefield of ideas. My name is Chris Pilier with lanternsofliberty.us and the battlefieldofideas.com. Wanted to thank you for joining me. What I want to discuss today is something that is often talked about, but nobody ever really digs into the details. And that particular topic is progressivism. And I know that there's probably people here that have heard me talk about this or possibly read about my opinions on it, but I want to break it down to its more fundamental principles. I want to explain basically and very briefly where it came from, and I want to explain it in a graphical context, because I think that when you see things in pictures, it helps. It really does help give you a better view of what something is. So, first of all, in order to discuss what it is, we must discuss what it isn't. Progressivism isn't some kind of conspiracy theory. We could argue that it's a conspiracy because a conspiracy is a collection of people that are doing something that's unlawful. And progressivism aims to undermine the Constitution, which is our law. So arguably, we could say it's a conspiracy if we want to look at the definition of words. People often, when they hear the explanation or my explanation of progressivism, it's not exclusive to me. Other people have explained it. Have said it's a conspiracy theory. And those are usually deniers or arguably even people that are involved in the conspiracy. But I want to break away from the whole idea of a conspiracy and talk about it because it, in an intellectual sense, because it is an intellectual process. Doesn't mean that it's a good process. It doesn't mean that it's a equitable or economical process that works, because they do have economic factors to it. It is built on the idea of social justice. Some people call it the means to the ends. In other words, the means don't matter. It's only the ends that matter. We've heard politicians explain it in so many ways that never let a crisis go to waste, which we'll watch some brief videos. But what I want to do is I want to start off with its foundation, because progressivism really is Marxism. That's all it is. Karl Marx designed the theory of Marxism, and it was built on top of several different foundations, one of them being Hegelian dialectics. If you're familiar with Friedrich Hegel, he was a philosopher, and he came up with a process called the Hegelian dialectic process, or dialectic process, is one thing that you may have heard of. It's also built on Darwinism. Charles Darwin came up with the theory of evolution. Marx believed in the theory of revolution, which Marxian dialectics or materialism, dialectic materialism, was a form of revolution. And it could take a violent process or a non-violent process. Progressivism is the non-violent progressive measure in order to achieve a certain ends. It is incremental. It's step by step. And it uses a dialectic process in order to get there. So let's explain or define Hegelian dialectics, because I think it's very important to break things down to their definition. So Hegelian dialectics, the theory from Hegel, is an interpretive method in which some assertable proposition, or a thesis, okay, is necessarily opposed by an equally assertable and apparently contradictory proposition, which is an antithesis. So you have a thesis and an antithesis, okay? The contradiction being reconciled on a higher level of truth by a third proposition, which is a thesis, synthesis. So it's important to realize it is a higher level of truth. So you have a thesis and antithesis that contradict each other, and they create a new truth, which is a higher level of truth, which is called a synthesis. Now, if we talk about absolutes and relativism, we often talk about moral relativism with liberals, and what is moral and what is immoral. And some people have their own definitions of morality. That is relativism. It's not built on absolute truth or an absolute. God being an absolute. So this dialectic, this Hegelian dialectic, is that process, and it is, you can actually see it in a diagram, and I'll go ahead and show you one here. So if you look at the diagram, what you see at the bottom is a thesis, and that thesis comes into contact with an antithesis, which is the contradictory statement. Those two conflict and cause or create a synthesis. And then from the synthesis actually becomes another thesis. It's another level. It's another step. And that synthesis comes into conflict with another contradictory statement or the antithesis and creates another synthesis. So it's an upward spiral, okay, which is extremely important. We have to look at this as a process or a progress. You know, if you often hear about progress, this is what progressives are talking about as far as progress. This is the framework, okay? Now, you can take thesis, antithesis, and change them into something else. You can actually, and we'll look at that here in a minute, but you can actually put in policy. You know, when we talk about bipartisanship, the bipartisanship between Democrats and Republicans is the synthesis. Okay, so now we've explained Hegelian dialectics. Let's talk about dialectic materialism. And I don't want you to get too it is an esoteric discussion. So just follow me, because this is really important where it goes, and I do bring some tangible things in here. So dialectic materialism, we first have to understand, we understand the dialectic. I just showed you the Hegelian dialectic. We have to understand what materialism is. Some of you may know, but this is basically what it is. It's a preoccupation with or emphasis on material objects, comforts, and considerations with a disinterest in the rejection, with a disinterest in or rejection of spiritual, intellectual, or cultural values. So it is a preoccupation, it's a focus on material objects, okay? Materialism. It's the material. This phone is material. This mouse is material. It's tangible. You can put your hands on it. Money, wealth, those things are material. It's a rejection of the spiritual. It's a rejection of prayer. It's a rejection of God. It's a rejection of the intellectual. So intellectualizing, coming to a truth or an absolute truth is an intellectual discussion. cultural values. So the idea of abortion being something that is a value to the Christians, it needs to reject that because values have no material aspect. Okay, so dialectic materialism, let's define that. Dialectic materialism is the philosophical approach expressed through the writings of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, and later by Georgy Plekhanov, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, and Joseph Stalin, the official philosophy of communism. It's important to know, it is not communism, it is a philosophy of communism. Communism is built on the ideas of Karl Marx. Its central tenet, this is very important, its central tenet borrowed from Hegelianism is that of all historical growth, change, and development results from the struggle of opposites. The struggle of opposites, the thesis and the antithesis, is a struggle. Those two items struggle. Okay? Okay. So, in philosophical terms, a thesis is opposed by its antithesis, which results in a synthesis. We just talked about that. Specifically, it is the class struggle. The struggle between the capitalist and land-owning classes on one hand, and the proletariat and peasantry on the other. That creates a dynamic of history. The laws of historical dialectics are seen to be so powerful that individual leaders are of little historical consequence, originally conceived as operating primarily in that social, economic, and political realm. The principle was extended in the 20th century to the scientific realm as well, with major effects on Soviet science. Marx and Engels stated that philosophical views, mainly in the course of polemics, it's important, in the brief historical studies, there is no systematic exposition of dialectical materialism. Okay. So it is a historical process. You may have often heard people say that Marx believed that capitalism inevitably evolves into socialism, which evolves into communism. You can see the chart here of what Marx believed historically was the process from primitive communalism to scientific communism. So this is a process over time. It's a historical process. We go through primitive communalism, Oriental despotism, Greek-Roman slavery, feudalism, which feudalism was around the time of the turn of the 20th century, and capitalism is what came out of feudalism. So the Soviet Revolution was one expression between feudalism and capitalism to communism. Okay, so it actually skipped over capitalism because when the empires fell in Europe, in the Eastern Europe, the feudal system, capitalism came out of that, but it was polluted because you really still had feudalism in a sense. You had a rich, wealthy class and a very poor proletariat or serf class, right? So it still was part of feudalism. Capitalism really came in the United States. So from capitalism comes scientific communism, which, if you understand what communism is, it is not national in nature. So the idea of the Soviet Union really wasn't true communism. It was an expression of what they were trying to accomplish. Communism is a world utopian system. It encompasses everything. It is the final step, the final stage of the Marxian process. Does it make sense? Okay. So here's another chart that I wanted to show where you see that there's the struggle is what we often hear the communists talk about, or Marxists. They talk about the struggle between the proletariat, which is the middle class, and the bourgeois class, or the bourgeoisie, which, if you have the nobles and the slaves, they have struggle. The lords and the serfs have struggle. The bourgeois and the proletariat have a struggle. Eventually, you get socialism, which is the process between, or the step between communism and capitalism. And that socialism is where the wealth begins to be redistributed. And eventually you attain communism. So this is a very, very simple theoretical idea that Karl Marx had. Okay, now, Marxists utilize this paradigm in order to politically progress society. We hear, here's a quote from Lenin. Lenin said that sometimes history needs a push. So the idea that Marx gave, the paradigm that he built, Lenin executed that process. Lenin's just one of many. Remember, there's no individual leader that does this, okay? It is a movement through history. It is inevitable. It's evolution. This is not something that an individual does. It's inevitable that we get to communism. There's nothing we can do. It just eventually will get there. Okay? So let's go a little further here, because I think that, we've laid some good groundwork. So how do we look at this in today's current system? Well, we're going to do that here. In our next segment, we're going to discuss, I'm going to show some video. The best way I know to do this is to show a Marxist or a progressive and show them speak. Listen to their words. We will analyze Barack Obama's words. Because Barack Obama is a Marxist. He's a progressive. It's the same thing. You can call it a Marxian progressive socialist, whatever you want to call it. I know it's controversial. I know people think, oh, God, it's a conspiracy. It's not. It's very simple. And we're going to analyze his words, and when we get back, we'll explain it.